Well, good evening. Thank you for coming to another of Bill's Design Talks. You know that the Cooper-Hewitt Museum itself is currently under renovation, so we don't have a space for doing the talks in the main campus. But we do have everything finished there on the side of the campus in the townhouses, and we've moved in with the staff and our National Design Library and our MA program that we do with Parsons. We have a beautiful new facility in Newark for storing all the things that used to be in those buildings. And a couple of years from now, in the spring of 2014, we'll be reopening the mansion with 60% more space for all our exhibitions, which would be wonderful. So in the meantime, we're trying to be other places. And we're particularly grateful to have the opportunity to be here at the WNYC Green Space. Thanks to Laura Walker for letting us be here, and also for Adobe to helping us make this possible. This actually is the almost last in the series this season. We have a series of 8, and this is the 7th. So I'm really thrilled to have Walter Hood here to talk to us about landscape architecture. I've been trying to get a real star in each discipline this season, and he's going to tell us about his work in culture and architecture and design and landscape, which is fabulous. As you probably know, and I hope you saw, we had the show at the United Nations last fall called the Design for the Other 90%, or Design with the Other 90% Cities, which is about the fast expanding cities around the world that have these wonderful collaborations between local design talent and international design talent. And at the moment, we've just opened a new show called Graphic Design Now in Production, which this is the beautiful catalogue. That is going to be open on Governor's Island every weekend from now until Labor Day. And you can get the free ferry from the bottom of Manhattan or from Brooklyn. The show itself is free. It's a really lovely show. It's curated with the Walker. Andrew Blauvelt is the Walker curator, and Ellen Lupton is our curator who've put this show together. And our last Bill's Design Talk, which is actually 2 weeks from now, on the 28th of this month, we'll be celebrating that. So we have managed to get Andrew Walker to come in from Minneapolis, and he'll be making a presentation rather comparable to Walter today. But we'll also be inviting Dimitri Nieuwenhuizen, I hope I did that right, over from Holland. He's a member of that very innovative Dutch group that is called Lust, and they're responsible for the big illuminated interactive wall that you see when you come into the show. So please take a chance to visit Governor's Island and see the show sometimes this spring. It's really an interesting show because it's about the way that graphic design is emerging as something where the designers are becoming producers, that they're not just doing design for other people or other things, they're doing new things which are innovative both with print and media. So it's fascinating. Yeah, we're looking forward to that. 2 weeks today. And as always, we have everything online and streamed. So tonight we're streaming, but also if you want to see this talk or any of the other talks in the future, you can just go to our website, or you can go straight to YouTube and just type in Bill's Design Talks, and you'll find the previous talks from the season and last season. So now, let me welcome Walter to tell you about his life, his work, and his philosophy. Thank you.
Clicking as well? I'm doing the clicky as well? Okay. Thanks a lot, Bill. How's everybody doing tonight? I'm really impressed you guys are here. The weather outside is too good, and if I didn't have to be here, if I could clone myself, I'd be out in the park somewhere, but I really do appreciate it. So I'll try to be entertaining, right? I'm not going to talk about, what did you say, life, practice, the pursuit of happiness, something like that. Bill wanted me to sort of start out having a conversation tonight and then He's going to come back up after about 20 minutes, and he's going to ask me some questions based on ideas that I've posited. I'd like to talk tonight not about, go through a slew of projects, but try to sort of give you some insight why I do what I do and how we do it. It's been a long road for me to a certain degree through teaching and practice. I've had my own office now for 20 years. I've been practicing for 30 years. I'm still 25. You figure out how to do that with age. But this notion of how do you maintain, people always ask me, you teach full time? How do you maintain a practice? And it's really, really hard. My students love me sometimes and they hate me. My clients love me sometimes and they hate me. And that's the affair, right? But the bigger issue for me has been working in an office. In a practice, there are a set of skills that you need, but understanding practice is specialized. From the beginning, you're taught, if you're going to be an architect, you're going to be an architect. It's scientific. There are ways of doing things. And I'm thinking more in the design arts, architecture, landscape architecture, planning. It's standardized. At a certain degree, things become very clear. I remember working in an architectural office and just like, that last project we had, just use those details. Boom, put them in there. It's the same thing over and over and over again. And it's bounded. It's really hard to cross disciplines. So you can get training in architecture, art, landscape architecture, planning, and then you try to do all of them, right? You get attacked from all sides. Because in a way, you're taking someone else's breadcrumbs, right, to a certain degree. So how do you balance all of these things? And that's been my pursuit, unconsciously, I think, for the last 20 years. And I've sort of arrived at a point where I do think this dance is between the practical and the speculative. And I think that's been the question since day one for thinkers. It's like, how do you get there? But then, can I stray off course every now and then? And this little diagram that I'm showing sort of talks about this idea that there are these points, right, of periods of determination which become really, really important, that you got to make decisions. And one little thing of advice I can give you, learn to make decisions and then forget and keep going. Right? If you don't make decisions, you're in the abyss. So there is a point in time when you're starting any project where you can bring in doubt. You can begin to question things, but you got to get back. So it's like a jazz musician or anyone playing with an accompaniment. You just got to get back and you got to get done. And so this diagram has been very helpful to me because it allows me to navigate. Whether I'm doing an art project, whether I'm doing a landscape project, small-scale architecture, or anything, it allows you to navigate and know when to leave the door open and when to close the door. And I have people working for me all the time, and they want to close the door because they're just scared, right? It's like Dee Dee is due tomorrow. Walter went on a trip somewhere. He came home. He had this great idea, and he's ready to change something. And the person working, they're ready to close the door. And I'm like, no, just leave it open a little bit longer. Because you know what's going to happen when you close the door. We know how to get there. And so that's how we pretty much navigate our projects. Now, within the context of my work is pretty much my interests, which comes out of, I guess, again, not something that I thought about at the beginning, but who I am, where I'm from, it's led me to I like working with people. And I'm always blown away by, I always get introduced as, Walter, he likes working with people. And I've said this a million times. It's like no one likes working with people, right? And particularly if you're in environmental design, you're working with people. And so I've come to appreciate that when I'm working with a project, the client, the community, space and time is just really important. And you got to find ways to connect to people. And there is no standard way of doing it. Every project is different, and you have to find your own way in. If you parachute in, you'll find out something completely different than if you roll in, if you come in a limo, if you come in on a taxi cab, if you're on a bicycle, if you jog there, it's different. And so how you arrive at a place, that's how they're going to see you, but it's also how you're going to see them. But for me, this triangle of the mundane and everyday has always been something that I've been interested in. And these are the forgotten spaces. I look right outside here. There's probably, within the public realm, right now, there's probably $50 million worth of stuff out here that no one really thought about. And that, to me, is where I like working. Those spaces that you're in all the time, and you don't realize it. They smell like pee sometimes. They have cigarette butts. There's someone lying down sometimes. They look standardized, but those are the places where we're investing and no one's thinking about it, and we spend all of our time there. And so those are the kinds of spaces that we're really interested in charging. For me, can I make that stop sign over there come alive? Can I make that autonomous box have a life? Can I give something to a surface? Can I make people actually see a tree that's been there the whole time? And again, I've worked on projects where people email me, I hate palm trees. Why did you plant palm trees? I've never planted a palm tree in any project. I will go online saying that. I've never planted a palm tree. They were already there. It's just people's ability to see that. But this notion of the mundane and everyday ties with the commemorative and community design. And I use the term commemorative only in the sense that we need to remember that cities are palimpsests, that someone came before us and someone comes behind us. And we need to engage in that. And as Americans, we're very good at wiping things clean and starting over again and inventing. It's almost like, well, it is like some things we don't like, our history, and we don't want to remember. And I can understand not wanting to remember some of the stuff, but it's there, and someone remembers. Remember a quote by Kenneth Foote talks about, remember what you bring back, because what you bring back is what's going to stay with you. And a lot of the things that we bring back are not always for everyone. They're only for a small few. So that triad, to me, sort of structures my interests, but it also gives rise to what I call a cultural practice. And I've only tried to articulate this in the last 5 years as I've gone back to school at the Art Institute, sort of part-time with Mary Jane Jacobs, to try to sort of understand how my work somehow manifests itself. So it's not something that I think about all the time. I'm actually writing a thesis. Hope Mary Jane sees this. Okay. I'm going to show 10 very quick projects and try to highlight what I mean by the speculative versus the practical. This first image you're seeing is the School of the Art Institute gallery in downtown Chicago. I first walked into this gallery. There was a beautiful show on, I can't remember the artist right now, but there were these vitrines that floated around the space. This was an old department store. And she was very interested in bringing back the memory of the department store. But all I could see was this giant vent that was corrugated metal that stretched all the way through the space. And it was as if no one else saw it. And so all the other artists were making work. But there was this huge vent that just ran from one end to the other, and it went right into a glass wall and stopped. And so this project is called Bioline 1, and it really looks at not only making a piece of sculpture, but it asks the question, can sculpture actually connect to this particular place and become part of the space and not actually part of the gallery? And so, like a parasite, it literally attached itself to the vent and in some cases disappeared. And most people didn't even know it was a piece. And in Art in America, it was the last sort of piece in their review. And they said, at the end of the show, you're walking around and then you look up and you see this piece that's been with you the whole time. And so for me, asking that one question allowed us to look at and make this project, which was really about this vent that was taking air from outside, shoving it through the space, cleaning it, but it was also being contaminated, and we were asking ourselves, could we clean it? And so we basically had plants in the above the filter that actually cleaned and created a cleaner environment, took away a lot of the VOCs. This next project is a streetscape project in Powell Street, San Francisco. And this is the Parklet program that San Francisco was probably the first to sort of institute, where they were taking over parking spaces and making parklets. And if you go to most, basically you take over the 8-foot parking space, I think New York has a couple of them, and you put in a new use. It's either pedestrian or seating. And in most of the parklets, it's all about people sitting and eating. On Powell Street, this is where the trolley goes. This is where about 35,000 people, tourists come. So it's really about people moving. But Audi gave the city $1 million. And they wanted to brand their A4 car. And the city didn't want them to advertise. So it was kind of this weird thing where I'm giving you money, but I can't talk about me giving you money, right? It's so San Franciscan, right? So they asked me to come up with a design that could somehow be emblematic of what they do. And if you know Audis, they are aluminum chassis. They're very light. They're highly engineered. And in the last few years, they've really been thinking about good design. And so we fabricated everything out of aluminum, had very few plant materials, but the idea was to create a landscape that basically moved the sidewalk out, but didn't talk about the street. The way we think about the street is a streetscape, but actually talked about the trolley and the engineering of the street. And so when you look at it, it's a very foreign-looking place. But after 8 months, they did a study, and sure enough, people stay, and they spend more money. I mean, that's the big issue. This is a shopping street. This is not a street where you have cafes. It's a street that people move through. Splash Pad Park, which is underneath a freeway, started out as a $750,000 crosswalk program. There was an island in the middle of the road. You came under the freeway, and you needed to get over to a historic movie house. The RFQ was, we need someone to come in and actually increase the sidewalk and do bulb outs. You guys know what bulb outs are? You take a corner, you get rid of the parking space, you make it a bigger radius so that you have a shorter crossing distance. It's called a bulb out. You bulb out the road, right? A lot of people do this. You get a job to bulb out, you bulb it out, you get paid, and you're gone. That's all you need to do. And of course, we came in and said, wow, what if we got rid of the traffic circle and actually expanded the space from the freeway, didn't do bulb outs, but actually made the space wider versus dealing with the road? Take out a lane of traffic so people could stack longer to get on the freeway, and then make the road narrower. And they say, can you do this for $750,000? Of course not. But we posited the question, and someone, the political will, came right behind us. The council person who was here, it turned out he was a one-time council person, ended up saying, I'm a champion in this project, and we ended up doing this, and now this is probably one of the strangest projects I've worked on, where it's a community center every Saturday. It's a huge market that takes place selling food and all other good stuff under the freeway. And if you go to the website, Splash Pad Park, you'll see they do events, they do community cleanups, but it actually became a space that gave the community an identity. And the space was already there, it just had roads on both sides. Again, asking a different question. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, there is the arena for the Pittsburgh Penguins is that circular thing. If you've been to Pittsburgh, this was just torn down, actually. But it was one of those mid-century feats, maybe the 70s, where the dome opened up, and peeled back. And I think it did it once or twice, and then it stopped doing it. But they remade the Penguins arena next to it, and that little red thing there is basically a site that tries to talk about when the first arena came in, it supplanted that neighborhood, and that's called the Hill District, right? And the RFP went out like this. We want a landscape architect and an artist to come in. The landscape architect, we want you to take all the storm water from the upper plaza and clean so that the building can get its leads points. We also want an artist to come in and commemorate the neighborhood that used to be there. So we said, okay, let's just go after the project. And we came up with a bioswale that basically cleans the water and everything. But we also said, instead of doing a statue or some plaque, could the bioswale actually talk about the community? And we created a project called Garden Passage, where we wrapped each bioswale or rain garden with images of people who used to live in the community. Right? And so we asked people to give us images. And so we started collecting images. And their faces, the people who were pushed out of the community, their faces come back. That's why it's called curtain call. And then another layer, we looked at the neighborhood, which was the Chicago of the East. If you went from New York, Pittsburgh, Chicago, it was one of the most amazing music scenes at one time. George Benson, if you guys know George Benson, Lena Horne, a lot of people played in the Hill District. And so we also wanted to sort of bring some of that culture back to this narrow space. And so the idea is that you come into a rain garden and you find images of people who used to be there. And when you come in, it triggers music. And there are rain songs, and we've been collecting rain songs from R&B, like Rainy Night in Georgia, I Can't Stop the Rain, all of that. And so this idea of a rain garden, which the architects need to get their lead points, actually becomes the trigger for culture. So again, we could have done a rain garden, right? Gotten paid. Probably would have built it. It would have been built by now. This is not built yet. But we could have done the project in a very simple, practical way. But we chose to ask a different set of questions, which then led us to this process where we had a cookout, and then people started coming, and now our archive is growing. We're working with Pitt and Carnegie Mellon to build an archive. We then found out about Teenie Harris, who was a photographer. There was a big Teenie Harris show, and it's become this larger juggernaut. And I just met her. I got this email. This is back in the... She'll kill me. This must be the 70s. I'm looking at the clothes. Must be the 70s or the 80s. But she works now for the nonprofit. She asked someone, she said, Mr. Hood has been showing my picture. She gave me this picture for the wall, and I use it because she's so fine, right? And I use this picture, and she's like, you got to have breakfast with me. So a month or so ago, I actually met her. And then she told me all the pictures that she had given me. She pointed out her father, her uncle, and everyone. So that was really amazing. In the same city, this donut, this big green thing with the hole in the middle, is a master plan, which we were hired by the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy to create a master plan for the Hill District. Now, again, we could have taken a typical master plan, done streetscape elements, park elements, done it in a very simple way, gotten paid, the fee wasn't that big, and gotten out of town. But again, we asked a different question. And the question was, could we show people the place in which they lived so that we didn't have to do a master plan? A master plan suggests you come up with an idea that's in the future, right? In most places, in most cities now, most people don't see the merits of their place. They just can't see it. Either they've been told it's awful, they've been educated that they should move elsewhere. And the Hill District, if you've never been to Pittsburgh, go to Google Earth, and it's the biggest green patch of stuff anywhere within, I would say, 20 miles around the downtown. It's bigger than Shimley Park, the big 19th century suburbs. It's got more biomass. And it's probably got about the same amount of people now, right? And so our idea was to get people in the Hill to basically see that they lived in the suburb. It just looked differently, right? And so for the final plan, we took them on a walk through the suburbs. So this is not Africa. This is in downtown Pittsburgh. And you see turkeys there, you see rabbits, people talk about living the leisure country life, and you're literally 20 blocks from downtown. And this idea that we need to change that with a master plan and get people to say, oh, let's clean it up again and see it differently was not what we wanted to do. And so the green print was actually adopted by the community. And as one lady said in the community, she said, Walter hears us, and then he whispers back what we can't see. So again, I'm that little bug in their ear going, it's okay. This place is beautiful. And at the end of this project, the city put on its books a list of all the vacant properties in the neighborhood, and they were going to sell them. And with this thing in hand, they were able to stop the sale of all of those private lots until they could actually come up with their vision. And the idea of this is not a master plan, but it's a plan that validates that there is an existing place where people live. Very quickly, the DeYoung Museum, which probably about 8 years ago, we had a fantastic time working with Herzog and Demeron on this project. But very quickly, the landscape here is one of those sublime landscapes. I learned a lot about the Bay Area through this project. The Golden Gate Park was a sand dune. It's a very simple story, no different than Central Park was a swamp, right? Someone had an idea about transforming that landscape. The sand dune was actually filled in with dirt by some of the hills cut down, and they built a park. And then people came and lived next to it. You go out there, it's windy as heck, it's cold. You pour a glass of water in the ground, it disappears. You plant a tree, it won't grow because it's sand. So anything you plant, you got to bring dirt for. And so we said, that's interesting. These palm trees were given to the museum 100 and so years ago, and we talked to the client to save them. So they took the plants away, and we brought them back. They now sit over a parking garage. But the idea is that they're artifice. So who cares, right? I mean, they set in sand before. So all the plants you see at this garden actually come from within the environs, within a mile around the building. And they're all gifts to the city of San Francisco from places like Australia, Tasmanian tree ferns, right? And people, the whole time we're doing this design, people, are you going to build a native garden? It's like, yes. So this is a native garden. It's native to this area. And this is a view out of the top gallery looking back towards the park. The first 2/3 is our space, but everything else is the park. Monterey pines, redwood trees, all the stuff that Australia and California shared. That ecological history, late 19th, early 20th century, is manifest there. And I don't need to tell people that, and we don't tell people that, but this idea that culture is already looking at this as native. And so it just reinforces, again, a cultural idea. Closer to you here in New York, these 3 long bands was a competition we won 3 years ago for a solar array up in Buffalo. And it's actually coming to fruition. We won the competition because, again, we asked the question. They said we have 5,000 3x5 PV panels. They said 3 artists, Vito Acconci, Diana Belmori, and Walter Hood, do something with them. I don't know if Diana or Vito would agree with me, but they tried to change the 3x5 panels. You can't change the 3x5 panels. They're 3x5. You can throw them in the air, you can turn them sideways or whatever, they're going to stay 3x5. And I learned this from Pete Walker. Pete Walker told me once, like he was teaching a course at Berkeley, and it's like, parking lots, why are you trying to make them circular? The car is a rectangle, right? And he's like, he's right. You know, you go to any parking lot, it's a rectangle. It's a lot of rectangles. And so we created a design that was a rectilinear, but we made a 1/4 mile long line of 3 sets of PV panels. That's about 2,500 panels each. And they striate the landscape to allow people to move through them, but they also harness the sun. They also changed the landscape. They allowed us to critique the campus landscape that moved a creek to make a campus landscape that had bad soil. So most of the trees on this campus in Amherst, they don't grow. They're all root bound. And so we use this idea of creating this linear script. You see those things to the left of the panels is the mowing regimen. So we reintroduced a different mowing regimen to actually show them that through, for no better word, neglect, through not cutting, you could actually get a more biodiverse sort of landscape that things could grow in. Because they had already started this, and everybody hated what it looked like. But we found out that there's like 40 different species growing in this place that was just left go, which is an old creek bed. Right? So there's a lot of vernal pools and things like that. So our design was not only about laying out PV panels, but it was also getting the students involved, planting more trees, bare root, planting them the right way, and really thinking about the ground. And now they have a whole sustainable campaign around this that's not about PV panels. It's about sustainability and changing the landscape. And this is that landscape that really needs to be changed, right? But you can kind of see the array right in the middle, and hopefully it'll grow out and change that mowing regimen. I mean, the guys that we have mowing, they really love us because mowing has purpose now. Where before mowing was just mowing. Now mowing has purpose, and you could actually be amongst the PV. I think this is the last project. This is Wyoming. You would never think it, right? This is in a parking lot in Jackson, Wyoming at the Wildlife Museum. You're looking to the right is a moraine where the glacier came through and actually created the hole. Every year, millions of people come to watch the elk bugle here. Or they come to Jackson for good food, or they go skiing. When I was hired to do a sculpture trail. And the idea was the trail would go next to this parking lot. I arrived here, I'm in the middle of Jackson, Wyoming. I'm from Oakland, and I know better, right? I'm in Wyoming. Look at that. That's like a Donald Judd, right? They surface that parking lot every year. In Jackson in the summer, it gets really hot. In Jackson in the winter, it gets really cold. And the landscape is this huge landscape. The building is by Kurt Fentress. And I think one of the donors had looked to Ireland, one of the castles, the old ruins in Ireland, and said, I want the building to look like that. And it does. And you almost miss it So they had to put a giant elk out by the road so that you could actually see it. So we came in and said, okay, the first thing I said was, let's not call it a trail. And they went, why? Just work with me. Let's not call it a trail. So for 3 years, we went through this process of me talking them out of removing that parking from the edge and actually making it people space. And actually, the last 6 months of the process, they said, can we take out more parking? And the whole idea was to get people, that landscape is amazing. And sitting in your car, people are so used to sitting in their car, seeing the landscape, they couldn't see the landscape. And so you get dropped off in front, we tuck the car away, and now you walk in front of the building and the landscape comes down. The view is sublime. You can actually walk out. We just built it and then it snowed. And then I don't have good pictures. It snowed again last week. So you have like 2 weeks of sun. But this idea that landscape comes right up to the building now. We put in new trails. We put in, I call it a terrace. They still call it a trail. But now you have this terrace that you can actually sit on, and you can see the elk right there. And you can't see the road down before. Before, you parked at the edge, you could see the road, and the elk were secondary. And so now, primary to your experience, just asking the question, not mentioning the word trail. Because in people's mind, they kept talking about this thing that they walked on that was 5 feet wide. Actually, it's not the last one. In Virginia, at the University of Virginia, this is a small project, cost less than $500,000. A small homestead was found, and they asked the question that we needed to do some interpretation over the people who were there. And I came up with this idea of a Shadowcatcher. And instead of doing a pedagogical display where you came in and you found remnants, I wanted to do something that was much more spatial, but I also wanted to do something that was spiritual. I'm from the South. I grew up in North Carolina. Spent a lot of my youth on Tobacco Road. And I remember my grandmother always talking about things in a very spiritual way, or my father telling me about the haints and the things that live in the landscape. But they also talked a lot about life and death. And there were these things that happened when people passed away. You did different things. Either you had a wake, open casket, food in someone's house, and the landscape was allowed to come through. There was also things you did when someone died. You put poinsettias on their grave. And I never understood this. You would go to the cemetery and there would be green or red foil around poinsettias, and people would take them, or lilies. And then they would pull back the foil, and it would be shiny. So I'm in college reading Robert Farris Thompson's Flash of the Spirit. And he talks about this idea that when you die in Southern culture, you need a ride to heaven. That you can't get there on your own. So if you go to New Orleans, they put little airplanes on the grave. So the flash is the flash of the spirit. So as soon as the light hits, right, the soul gets a lift, right? And so as I'm thinking about this project, I'm like, okay, I'm going to talk about this. And of course, I'm in these meetings and people looking at me like, who is this guy, right? So I came up with this idea of Shadowcatcher, and I show this image because they actually wrote it down and they got it perfect. It's a Shadowcatcher. It catches the shadow, but it also gives a reflection. And the notion of archaeology is it's uncertain. You make a grid and you say something's down here, and then you look for it, right? And I wanted to do something that did this kind of simultaneous reaction. It marked a place, but it also provided light. And so you're forced to always look down and look up, look down and look up as the spirit is working its way through the portal. And it's a very strange project. It looks nothing like anything around it. It doesn't look like the brick buildings. It's very spare. And when there's no sun, there's no shadow. But when the sun comes out, it activates itself. And this is the cemetery that sits right next to it. Okay, Bill, I think I'll stop with that.
All right, thank you.
Is that okay?
Great.
Okay. Just checking.
So, of course, you won one of the National Design Awards a couple of years ago.
The good one, as I'm told.
Congratulations.
Yeah. It was the 10th anniversary one, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the good one. Yeah.
The important one.
Yeah.
But I noticed actually on your website that you have an entries in your award list of 29 awards. So
29?
yeah,
Oh my
29
God.
entries. So that must be pretty gratifying. I mean,
I didn't know I had 29 until you just told me. Well,
But now you do.
Okay, well, that's actually pretty cool, yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's cool. I think you should be very... I mean, to have a tiny practice with only, you told me, 6 people,
Yeah.
and be teaching full-time, and have time to get 29 awards? I mean, what is this, man?
Well, it's just what I explained, though. I mean, you know, a lot of, you know, again, if you go out and just do your work, you know, benefits fall on the other side, but you can't worry about those things. I mean, I really didn't know of 29. I always think of what's current, you know, so.
Well, anyway, I think people are very interested in how you get from North Carolina Tobacco Road to that situation. So could you give us a little bit of a life story and tell us how this all happened, when you decided that you might want to do design, and how, and why you chose this mixture of landscape and other disciplines and culture?
I have no idea. I'm being very truthful. I was one of the first in my family to get a college degree. I wanted to go to Syracuse. My father wanted me to go to North Carolina A&T. I wanted to go to Syracuse because they, in their catalog, they had guys skiing, and I thought that was like really cool. I mean, at the time they had like chair lifts. Like, I'm like, Syracuse. Wow, thank God I didn't go to Syracuse, right? Mark Robbins, you didn't hear that. But you know, it was one of the things my father wanted me to go to an all-black school. We had spent most of our time in North Carolina, and I say that because I think my father wanted me to have a sense of myself. My father was a career military, and he was really proud that a son that he had that didn't think he was going to go to college actually got into college. You know, I was a bad kid. You know, I'll just be frank. I sort of played two sides of the coin. You know, you wanted to be the cool kid in school, but you also had to do your books. So it was that kind of thing. But then, you know, once I got to college, I was in architecture. And I remember Charles Fountain, who was the head of the program at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro. He started a landscape program, and he actually graduated from Berkeley. And he brought through Friedberg, I think Halprin, and one other landscape architect. And I can remember going to a lecture, and I was probably 19 or 20 years old, and seeing these guys lecturing and talking about people, but the drawings were amazing. That was the one thing that stuck in my head. And you have to remember, I'm doing drafting in architectural school, right? And it's just like nothing like what these guys were showing. I mean, Halpern was showing water bursting in the notebooks. Friedberg was showing, at the time he was doing those playground things, you know, and he was showing all these animated things. I was like, that's for me. And I changed, and I graduated the first class from an all-black school in North Carolina. I went to work in the Park Service very fast. Blue Ridge Parkway, did that while I was in school, and figured out landscape architecture. I came back to school as a senior and was like, I figured it out. You know, I had designed a couple roads and a couple visitor centers or something, but I knew how to grade and knew how to plant, and I figured it out. I then took a job in Washington, D.C. with the National Capital planning team out of the Denver Service Center, and we were out in Falls Church, and we designed during the Reagan years. And one of my first jobs was helping out with the stables for Ronald Reagan and Rock Creek Park. But I did a couple sewer systems for a couple of the larger parks. I worked on a visitor center in Harpers Ferry. Got a lot of great experience, and we built nothing. Because as soon as Reagan came, he just cut the belts. I mean, we did nothing. I mean, nothing got built. And then I got propositioned by a young man out of Philadelphia to come and work for him. And he was starting an all-black firm. It's like this is a funny story. And I went up to see him in Philadelphia, and he was in this place in Germantown, and I was like, I don't want to work here, man. This is not like my cushy office in Falls Church. This was in a community, and his name was Bill Wilson, and he had graduated from Penn, and he had assembled maybe 4 African Americans, me being one. One was actually my teacher from undergraduate from Ohio State. Another was a guy from Berkeley, Tony Palomore, who had graduated architecture at Berkeley, and myself, and we were kind of the core. And I learned so much in 5 years. We were doing work up here in New York at St. Nick's Park. We were doing what we call patch and match. And so we came into New York parks, and you have to go around, see what was broken, figure it out, patch and match it, And so I got a chance to know Harlem very well. Got some things stolen, but it was one of these things where my sister called it my normal years. I wore a tie, I had my nice suit, had my penny loafers. I was on the train every day. I was like, living the life. And then one day it occurred to me, we were doing some community work in West Philadelphia, and we're in a community meeting. It's like 7 o'clock at night. People were in the back. We made our presentation. It was like I had designed a little park for $30,000, 50th in Wingelhaken, I still remember, 40th in Wingelhaken. And it was the same design. It was a brick wall, 6 trees, game tables, and a water fountain. And that was it. And that's what we did in parks. You did the same thing every place. And you go to different communities, and people, of course, would be sleeping in the communities. And after a while, you just go, wow, is this it? And one of my mentors, she said to me, I don't want to be 35 years old drawing circles. And I always remember that. She became a lawyer. But I always remember that because it made me really think about, meaning in your work. That I could be a 35-year-old person, a grown man sitting there drawing circles, for the rest of your life. So I loaded up the truck and moved to Berkeley. And there I met Garrett Ekbo, changed my life. If you don't know,
you mentioned in your award acceptance speech, I remember, Garrett Ekbo is one of your most important mentors. Can you tell us more about how that was and why?
Well, Garrett was at the end of his career. He's probably in his late 60s. And I called him. I was looking for work, and I just called this guy, Garrett Ekbo. If you guys don't know him, you should just go Google him. This guy, I want to say 1930s. He comes out of school at the same time as Halprin. I mean, all of the Tommy Church, the kind of Western outdoor living, high modernism, but he never went corporate. He went corporate late and then decided to change. But he got out of Harvard and went to work for like the Farm Security Administration, doing migrant houses and landscapes in the Central Valley. This great education. Everybody else goes into corporate America, and Garrett stays true. But he never stops designing. So you see these designs. I was like archiving his work. He's putting 2 trees in one hole, trying to figure out, if I plant a long alley with 2 trees coming out of one hole, can I get something different? They're looking at Paul Klee, Kandinsky, and he's doing this through the FSA. And the whole time he's talking to me and telling me all this stuff, and I'm sitting there going, cool. You can actually have responsibility, and you could just be as zany and wacky as, the next designer. And then I met Randy Hester, a lot of people who had the Berkeley core, who had this other mission that was really about really looking at people and trying to understand communities and then making decisions about communities and sharing something of themselves. And that just changed my life, that you could actually do that. And then I met Lars Larup, and I met all these interesting characters who would just give me things to read. And it was what I call my liberal arts education that allowed me then to go back to practice. I thought I wanted to go into landscape, and then I decided school is too good. I decided to stay for an architecture degree. I started to stay for a planning degree, and I ended up at Berkeley for like 6-7 years. One of those students, people are like, you're still here? Yeah.
How many degrees do you have now then?
5?
5?
I think 1, 2. Yeah, 5. Yeah. So, but it's one of those things.
Do you need to do that to be interdisciplinary? I mean,
no, you need to do that to be stupid. No, I mean, for me, it's more about finding a culture that can somehow nourish, that hunger to a certain degree. I was telling you earlier, I just spent the last 5 years hanging out with Mary Jane Jacobs in the Art Institute. Very interesting.
So you had to go back to school.
Yes, interesting
Couldn't
to
get
be
away,
enmeshed
could you?
in art versus architecture versus planning. And artists think differently than architects. When I went to architecture school, architects think different than landscape architects. Go to planning school, planners think differently. But to put yourself in that context, not to become one of them, but to somehow allow that to force you to be adaptive in a different way, I just think it allows you to keep learning. I don't know about you guys as you get older, it's hard to keep learning because it's so easy to find satisfaction with what you know at a certain place. It's really hard to say, I'm open and okay, yeah, I don't know about that. Or it's really hard, that I find with a lot of people that I hire, I'm always saying, to say I don't know. You know, young people today, they go, yes. You go, that's wrong. Yes. They don't go, I don't know. Yes is the word, and I like going, I don't know. Because if you're saying yes, that just means you know it already, and you really don't know it. You're just afraid to say, no, I don't know. So in a way, putting yourself in a different cultural setting allows you to, at least it's allowed me to be a little bit more open and to be a little bit more attractive to grabbing onto new
And if
things.
you like working with people, you can ask other people.
Yes. And that's the other good thing. You know, if you ask other people, man, you don't have to do it all yourself.
Yeah, they tell you.
Yeah, so.
How nice. So thinking local, one of your projects I know is in Paisley Park, 50 Cent Garden in Jamaica. Can you tell us a bit about that, sort of as it's close to us?
Yeah, I haven't been out there in a couple of years. This was an interesting relationship with the New York Restoration Program through Bette Midler. I was approached, you know, they were asking a lot of landscape architects. I think Michael Van Valkenburg was doing one at the same time. His is in Manhattan. And they asked us to work with the community to come up with a new design for the garden that was there. And I went out there, and there was a local neighborhood where people were just like, we just want a place to hang out, which was kind of nice. But one of their big issues was they couldn't get water. You know, every time they needed water for the garden, they had to call the fire department. And the fire department had to come and open the hydrant. And so our design was pretty much, can we build a self-contained space in which they could literally harness and hold their water? So we built a cistern and some rain catchers for them. But the nice thing was, and I always tell the story, one of the young people working for the New York Restoration Garden went downstairs, and they saw this nonprofit was downstairs. And in the beginning, the project had very little money, and they were intrigued by this nonprofit called Gun It that was downstairs. And it's like, no, Gun It. And it was really talking about G Unit, right, which is 50 Cent's Posse, which is his nonprofit. But they ended up going down and talking to Gun It, G Unit, and G Unit actually endorsed the garden. And I think 50 ended up coming up with well over $300,000 for the project. And it's one of those things where just getting someone like that involved with community, and particularly landscape like there. On opening day, there were so many kids who wanted to see 50. They didn't care about me, but they just wanted to be there. And anytime there's an event, the kids will just be there. And through the hip-hop culture, there's just a different way to talk about health, to talk about food, to talk about community. And I think it's a very powerful kind of expression for cultures to start mixing, particularly in these kinds of places. And hopefully it becomes more sustainable, meaning the gardens last longer because they're able to actually do different things.
Yes. Well, perhaps we should ask some people from the audience if they'd like to join and have a discussion. So they'll put out a microphone or two, and please, if you come up and you want to say something or ask a question, do say who you are at the microphone, because streaming otherwise, they won't hear you. The streaming audience won't hear you. So please, anybody who'd like to join us, please step up. I'm sure there's going to be somebody, don't you think? Yeah, there's somebody.
Hi, Rostislav, student.
Hey, Ross.
Just as a question, so in asking questions to the community, I find that kind of just maybe this is something that I've heard, or maybe it's not true, but very oftentimes the people who are sponsoring the projects are often very afraid of the designers asking questions to the people. And I think that there's usually kind of like the people are all, and then sometimes there's also the people who start to feel like, well, you're the designer, why are you asking us questions? And so if you could just elaborate kind of on those.
I think I understand your question. A lot of clients, particularly doing public work, if you start asking questions, you can open up a quagmire. Just open it up, right? A lot of projects are already defined. So, from my experience, I find a lot of clients, they really want to hold it steady. Because you could go into the community, and the community is like, we don't want that, we want something else. And immediately you create something different. So that's really hard to negotiate. And I've worked on projects, actually, we've just finished one over the last 2.5 years, where we made work that was about questioning, and the client was like, you can't show it. And we went through an entire process where we just kept making the work, and they kept saying, you can't show it. And we went through the whole process and got something approved. And that work is still cataloged somewhere that I did based on those questions, and we never showed it. And the client has it. So it does happen. You just again, I think you have to sort of hold on to your convictions. Because for me, those questions allowed you to make the work. All they were interested in was the work. They weren't really interested in the dialogue. So again, you're finding that place. The other side with the community, I don't really, this idea of asking questions, to me, that's more of a conceptual way of thinking, because it's not always about asking questions. I mean, a lot of things we do is just through observation. A lot of it is just kind of, again, when I talked about the mundane, just a lot of things are just basic that we even forget about because we're thinking at this other level. So, I'm trying to remember the last time I worked with a community where we asked them specific questions. It's more about engaging in different ways and different ways to engage, which gives you much more variety, to approach a community and work with the community.
Hi, my name's Tom Goodrich. I'm an early childhood teacher. And I'm interested in how culture grows from nature. I'm interested in, for example, bringing kids out into the woods, into the local nature, and that our culture seemed to have strayed so much from nature. Any way you'd like to? I'm particularly interested in getting kids to know the Paul Shepard had a line. He was an ecological philosopher type person. And he said, to forge a whole human being requires an alphabet of biodiversity. And I don't know, when you're working with people at different places and in making them maybe more aware of what could grow there or what has grown there and everything, any things you'd like to say about that?
That's a good quote. I got to remember that quote. I guess it's kind of given, working in landscape architecture or working in environmental planning, it's a kind of a given that that's your medium, I don't tend to fall in the category where I'm always looking to articulate something different about landscape architecture per se. Sustainability, I try not to use that term. Rain gardens, all those things, or creek restoration. Every year there's something hot in green, right? But in a way, if you're working in landscape, working in urbanism, it's kind of that's the main ingredient that you have. And again, we forget these things, these basic things. I'm blown away by Manhattan because Manhattan's an island. You would never know it. Walking right down the street, you would never know it. Right? An island is a different ecosystem, right? It works, it performs in a different way, right? Let there be a meter change in sea level rise, right? You would actually experience this island, right? On a day when it rains more than 6 hours, you know you're on an island, right? Because water's everywhere. And so this notion that we can escape nature is major fallacy. We can choose to sort of articulate it and think about it as trees and squirrels and all of that stuff. But the reality is, if you look close, each place is different. And I think for youth to somehow understand that is our mission in life. I mean, one of my mentors, Randy Hester, used to always say, we've gotten rid of all the places where the boogeyman lives. So there are kids who've grown up and they've never had to deal with the boogeyman. Yeah, and I mean, and that's, to be, I couldn't imagine being 40 years old and never knowing what the boogeyman was like. I'd be a weak man. No, really, you got to know about the boogeyman. And so I just think we're depriving a lot of our youth that become adults of the way you look at the world. And this is the project when I was showing the Hill. This is one of the beautiful things about the Hill District. Our first day there, these kids come out of the bushes. Mister, come on in here. They just will say, come in. And these kids were in that landscape that I showed. And it was amazing. I had never seen that in any professional job before. And for me then to go in there and go, we need to clean this up and make a park, which people want to do. And so I just think, we have to be much more proactive about understanding where we live. And again, Pittsburgh is created by 2-3 rivers. And that's why it's emergent, because the rivers are still there. And that vegetation is going to be there as long as the birds are pooping and dropping the stuff. It's going to keep coming back. And so that, to me, is the story that I think a lot of youth are hungry for. We see this in our students at Berkeley in the environmental planning program. I see this in the young kids. They want to sort of understand, the relationship between things. So,
you did a little interview with Seamus Adams after you, or around the award, and I remember you saying that every site has a story, which I think is a little bit about the context, but you also said that it was not a narrative. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit the difference between your sense of story versus narrative.
Well, the story is, to me the narrative is there's a beginning and the ending, to a certain degree, and it's always the same. The story is always there. It could be different. It depends on how you tell it. At least where I'm from in the South, you can go to 5 people who have the same experience. They'll tell you 5 different stories, and they were in the same place. It just depends on how you tell it, and that's the beautiful thing about places. When you go and you embed yourself within them, you hear one person talking about the rain event that happened last week. Oh, it was raining cats and dogs, man. There were cars coming down the street. Then someone else describing it. Yeah, it was raining last week. I couldn't go outside at all. And those just 2 interpretations of something that happened. And to me, that's the beauty of being open versus being closed. And again, I think a lot of our design, again, in the built world, you look out there, it's designed through a single narrative. You walk down the street, you go in a door, you do this. It's not a story about a guy who falls down, a woman who comes by, picks him up, they fall in love, they have kids. It's not about the story of the person who finds a dime and gets the dime and buys a card and wins the lottery. That's a sidewalk. But if you thought about the story of the sidewalk, you could make these amazing spaces.
Yeah, anything could happen on a sidewalk, whereas a narrative could just be one into the other.
Well, and that's the way they're designed.
Yeah.
Right? It's designed as if there's a single narrative. And in places where, I was just in Rome, and the smart car is everywhere in Rome now, right? And the smart car now parks perpendicular to the curb and wall. So the story is, I got a smart car and I need a place to park, right? And you're walking and you have to go around the smart car. And it's just beautiful, though, because there's not a single narrative for the pedestrian way, right? It's a lot of stories about how one moves through the landscape.
So if you had to say something more about the relationship between being a landscape architect and the other disciplines that you've been involved with, or indeed other design disciplines, can you help us feel the connections there, or the disconnects, or the specializations, the separations and the connections?
Well, I can only say one thing. Landscape architecture is really, really hard. And the reason why it's hard is everyone thinks they can do it. That's what makes it really difficult. As an architect, I can have a client, and I say, you need to build it this way, and they'll go, thanks. As a landscape architect, I go in, and I go, well, we're trying to do this thing over here. But what about my granola? Can I put these gladiolas over there? Can I, it's like they know how to do it. It's like, why do you need me? Right? And that's really, really hard. It's really, really difficult because everyone thinks they can do your job. and so you find a lot of designs get compromised because, some client wanted this thing in the landscape. Very rarely will you see, you don't go to your doctor and go, But the architect, normally, you get the pass because the person just can't see it. Now, if you're doing kitchens or stuff, I'm talking about buildings, but it's one of those things that it comes up all the time, whether you're working with a public agency or a client. they know how to do it already. It's almost like you're just there to do the drawings for them. And a lot of projects you'll get, particularly public projects, they'll just lay out the design. The design's already done, and then they go, why are you doing these things? It's like, I thought I was hired to design. Oh, no, you're just hired to do my thing. So
to implement.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just
like
think it's
the
a really
developer
difficult.
and the architect?
It's really, really difficult. But I think it's the nature thing. It goes back to the nature thing. I just think, the green thing. Anybody can plant a tree.
And the idea of landscape is so integrative, isn't it? I mean, the fact that it is the connective tissue between everything. So it's an opportunity to be much more holistic than it is with the other design disciplines, perhaps.
Yeah, it is. But the thing is, I don't know about you guys, who has a garden? See? Most people, but most people, they know how to dig a hole and put something in that hole, right? I mean, that's not a no-brainer. And sort of like, well, I'm hiring you then to do what? And again, I think that's where the story comes. That's where the cultural connection happens for me, right? That's where the ride starts. You start that conversation. And, I've had clients, I just did a couple residential gardens, which we hardly ever do, for a client in San Francisco, in these very amazing neighborhoods. And we were doing these gardens, and he was saying, do your thing. Right? And it's like, wow, who are you? But he's selling the houses, right? And they become part of the sale. And thank God he sold the houses. But again, it's really trying to have that conversation with the client so that they understand what it is you bring to the table.
But then if you think about you mentioned Golden Gate Park and Central Park, I mean, Olmsted, that's a huge name and a huge beginning perhaps for us in terms of the way people think about landscape architecture. And that's a much bigger way of thinking about it,
yes,
isn't it?
It is. And it's a beautiful thing that we have these projects because everyone knows what Central Park is. And I'm blown away. I mean, people will it's the guys are in Central Park, they want you to get in and take the tour. They got all the Olmsted stories. It's like, that's pretty cool. You guys know Olmsted? It's like, yeah. So, no, it becomes, again, it only bolsters, the ability for designers, to provide a conversation at that level. And that's at a very prophetic level. When you think about these parks, I mean, they're happening at another sort of scale, but there's also a different vision. And, I'm hoping, and hopefully some of it came through some of the comments, that it's that kind of conversation that I like having with the clients and even with groups of people, that we elevate it and talk more about not just about the edifice, about these small things, but much more about these places in which we live. And, as Americans and designers, I want to get to that place where we can dream about the places that we live versus just settling. And it's great to see what's been going on in New York and Manhattan the last decade. I do think there's been this kind of renaissance here, design-wise. And I'm constantly, struggling in San Francisco, where I find the visual culture is lacking to a certain degree. We've settled because it's so beautiful. We can't make anything because it competes with the beautiful bay. But this notion of just settling, and that's why when I look out there, I see opportunity, particularly in the public realm.
And you talked fondly about the work with the De Young in Central, in Golden Gate Park. Herzog and de Moran, of course, were the architects of the building. Could you talk a little bit about working with them or any of the other relationships you've had with partnering with architects that you've enjoyed or found challenging?
Yes. See, how can I answer this? No.
I gave you 2 ways.
Yeah. Well, that project we talked earlier, I would have to say working with Herzog and de Moran really helped to empower me to a certain degree, because it was the first time that I saw architects actually working with clients in this way. And, it's been written about the kind of invasion of the European architects, and then they have the local, architect of record. And, they're design architects. And that term hadn't been used a lot, the design architect and the local. And as the design architect, then you get to be a designer. And as a local architect, you need to be in there in the trenches. And I'm thinking, God, I'm not the design or the trench person because I don't have that person working for me. But just sort of watching how they navigated donors, construction, everything through a European prism was very intriguing to me because they work like artists. Everything gets mocked up. Nothing gets decided. Drawings are just basically space planning. Three-dimensional things get built first before you draw them. The door stays open a long time. I mean, a long time. I mean, I'm talking CD, the door is still open, right? Which, is very frightening for a lot of clients. But through that process, it allowed me to, think about how the infrastructure you needed. I mean, I think at one point in time, they only had 2 people in the U.S. for that project. This is over a $100 million project. And the main office is in Basel. So just really thinking about how much you really need to put towards a project, how do you move it around, those kinds of things was just really, really helpful. And Pierre and Jacques are just, really, really smart, interesting people. So, and, in a way, after that, all the architects that I work with, then you have par, right? It's like you don't want to then go work for someone who's like complaining the whole time, telling you to do parsley around the pig. So you want to be engaged. And so, we have comfortable relationships, I think, with most architects we work with. But, they're all sort of, I think, part of that culture where they engage in speculative thinking, whether it's DSR, shop architects, people who really value ideas. Because, I'd rather sit around a room and talk about ideas than talk about, I need this tree in front of my facade, or don't put that tree in front of my facade.
Any other comments from the floor? Yes.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Peggy G. I'm from Toronto, recent grad of MLA. I just have a question. How do you convince a client of your design that might not be measured or quantified? Let's say stormwater or rain catchment basins, you could quantify these values, but then how do you convince them of a design where it's a cultural, more social value that improves the neighborhood, but how do you quantify that, or how do you convince them?
No, really. I mean, for a lot of this, no, I'm being very serious about this. Depending on the project you're working, though, if there are not goals of your client, a lot of times, we just won't articulate what we're thinking. Because a lot of these things, come out in different ways. They don't always come out in how can I say, in a pedagogical way that you can actually follow the breadcrumbs. And so, I mean, one is, you just do your work. It's what I was saying about the earlier project. We wanted social concerns. We wanted people to think about the larger landscape. We wanted all these social things, and all they wanted was the thing. And we kept making work to talk about that. And they kept saying, you're not showing that work. But that work allowed us to get to where we wanted to, and it manifests in a design. So you just have to just sort of keep plowing. I see I didn't answer your question. Yeah.
Well, you did. But, and then to my previous question, do you ever feel like you need to put a dollar sign to it for the client to say that if you built this, then this would improve the revenue of the surrounding property values, etc.?
Yes. Particularly for public work, we're constantly arguing that you have to spend more money. And I use it, I use the examples. I always go, if I'm working for a city, I always go to City Hall and I figure out the worth of the space in front of City Hall. And then if you're working in a community, you say, well, you spent $75 a square foot in front of City Hall, and you want to spend $5 a square foot in a community. And that's a really hard argument, right? Because they're politicians, right? I mean, but you're constantly trying to find, that leverage. But, there was a generation, a couple, in front of us who, for them to change, how can I say, social patterns in a place was to get people involved in building it themselves, and they had the dream of the democracy. Of course, it's mostly all brown and poor people that, these kinds of spaces are better for them. And I don't believe that. Those spaces are gone. Of course, it made people feel good, but then when they went home, people were still left with the wood and the stuff that they built, right? And so we're always arguing for craft and beauty in those places that need it the most. And that's a very simple argument to me. That's not a hard one to sort of fight. And if they choose not to do it, they choose not to do it, but it's not a hard one to fight. We should be spending the most money in those places that need it the most, not the least, but we actually do the opposite. So, okay.
One more here. Last question.
Hi, Susan, high school student.
High school?
Yeah.
Cool.
I was wondering what you would advise to young designers, especially, for example, how would we balance the difference between structure and discipline versus creativity?
That's a tough one to finish.
What grade are you in?
11.
Wow, that's a deep question. It's a balance, but I would put, and this is just me, I would put the structure first. Learn, practice good habits first, because the creativity is always there. It took me a long time to learn that, but get good at it. Practice it over and over. Just get good at it too. You don't have to think about it anymore. That's practice, right? And this is what I tell my students: is they come into school and they have these ideas. They want to. That's fine, but you want to do it through this medium. So let's learn the medium. Let's get good at it. And for me, it was like for years, and when I was telling the story earlier, I didn't know it. But the first decade of my training was my practice. I just didn't know it. I didn't know it until the other side, until I looked back, because I was a good drafts person. I mean, I could draw circles around people. I could make perspectives. I mean, for Garrett Ekbo, I spent 2 summers just doing perspective drawings. So I could just crank stuff out. So I didn't know that was what I was really learning until you then start thinking, and it's like, well, I can just do that. But it's a really hard thing now with the computer, the distractions and all that everyone wants it tomorrow. And the thing I would say to you at your age now, girl, just get good structure, and you can take that anywhere. Okay.
So, Walter, thank you for your optimism, for your craft, and for your empathy. Wonderful talk.
Thank you so much, Bill. Appreciate it. Thank you guys for coming out tonight.